This is episode 110 of the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I'm Carly Cade, and today I'm talking with Lisa D. Stewart. Lisa is the author of The Big Quiet, One Woman's Horseback Ride Home, which is a memoir about a 500-mile solo horseback trip she took at the age of 54 in 2012 on her horse Chief. Her first trip, 3,000 miles over 7.5 months with her former husband in 1982, gave her the skills and courage to finally take the trip she had dreamed about since she was a girl, alone with one horse through the Midwest. Lisa also is a poet and commercial writer in Prairie Village, Kansas. She specializes in research and business planning for agricultural companies and urban nonprofit organizations. Between 1984 and 1999, she and her former husband created and grew Orthoflex Saddle Company. After their 3,000-mile horseback trip with 5 horses taught them about the relationship between saddles and the biomechanics and soundness of the horse. The couple produced and sold more than 25,000 patented saddles with accessories in more than 30 countries. Lisa has published more than 100 articles on the topic of saddle fit. She currently is completing a book about the relationship between saddles, equine biomechanics, and proper palpitation techniques for soreness. She has 2 grown children in Kansas City and lives with her husband and their dog, Patty. Saddle up for a conversation about long riding a horse alone across the Midwest, overcoming the past, and saddle anatomy discoveries. Now, let's get into the interview. Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast, a podcast featuring interviews with equestrian authors who love all things horses and writing about them. In each episode, you'll hear inspirational stories from horsebook authors, including writing advice and marketing tips to help you write your very own horsebook. If you're an author, aspire to be an author, or simply love horsebooks, then you are in the right place. I'm your host, Carly Cade, and creative writing makes my spurs jingle. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I'm Carly Cade, and today I have Lisa D. Stewart on the show. We're going to talk about some fascinating long horseback journeys that Lisa's taken and a bunch of other great stuff. But welcome to the show, Lisa. Hi.
Hey, Carly, thank you so much for having me. It's so fun to get to meet you in person.
It's always the best to meet technically in person. I love the fact that we have this technology where we can actually talk to each other and meet each other and develop really wonderful relationships. And how I always like to start out the conversations is asking, Lisa, what is your relationship to horses? How did your love affair begin?
I have always said that I was born with a horse-loving gene. I have no idea how. I was born in Detroit. My parents didn't know anything about horses. My dad had been around horses in rural Oklahoma when he was a boy, but that was it. And it was just a drive that I always had. I had to have horse books and horse stories and model horses and calendars. And I think that I just forced the universe to manifest a horse for me when I was about 8 years old. And that's kind of how I feel it happened. My dad happened to move to Oklahoma City for a job at Aero Commander, and he made friends with a man who had land in Oklahoma, and therefore there was a place to put the horse. Not that we would be able to stable a horse or something. So the stars aligned and I got Honey. And by the way, this is her tooth.
Oh my goodness. You have a necklace on that's made from her tooth. Wow.
Yes. So she's always close to me. And horses are always close to me, and they're kind of good totem.
That's wonderful. And, that's the thing. Like, how do we remember our heart horses, as they move on? Like, what can we do? Jewelry, their hair, marker, favorite place. That's really lovely. Now, you were lucky enough to get a horse when you were younger, and you're like so many of us, we're just born with it, and our parents have no idea what to do with it, but it surrounds them, and then we move into riding lessons and riding. You still have horses, and horses have been a part of your life as you've grown into an adult. Do you want to talk a little bit about the horses perhaps in your life now, or adult horses?
Sure. We moved to rural Oklahoma when I was in junior high. So that I got Honey back, and then my dad bought me another horse that was young and untrained.
Mm.
And we just continued to live in the country, and then we moved to Missouri, so I moved both horses there, and I ended up marrying a farmer, which is part of the book because I did not stay married to the farmer, so that's part of the story and part of the narrative. So I then met, after I was divorced, I met a man who didn't know anything about horses, but I still had horses, and I took him riding literally behind me on the horse.
Oh.
And he was a motorcycle guy and a hunter. And he said, wow, that's good exercise. I said, yes, it is. And he says, we should ride to Alaska on horseback. And little did he know, I'd been dreaming about taking a cross country horseback trip since I was a little girl. I did not picture taking it with a man. I pictured taking it either alone or with my girlfriend. But I know even in my 20s, I would not have had the courage to have done it by myself.
Mm.
So we did do that, and we did a 3,000-mile horseback trip. And this is actually answering your question about horses continuing into adulthood.
Oh, it's perfect. Yes.
Yeah, but there is a reason for me telling it like this. So he took time away. His bulldozing business was going out of business. It was in 1980. And we had a terrible drought in the Midwest, which some people will remember way back then, and a bad recession. And so he was going out of business. And we, went to our pastor and said, what do we do? We want to take this trip, but we have these obligations. And he said, you know what? You take the trip and all that stuff will be here when you get back. So we talked to the bank and we just arranged it. And we rode off. We were trailered to northern New Mexico and rode north through Colorado into Utah. Well, in Colorado, we went to the western slope of the Rockies, past the Uncompahgre Plateau on that. Utah, past the Flaming Gorge, almost all the way to Jackson, Wyoming,
Wow.
in the Wind River Range, and then all the way back to Nevada, Missouri, our home. On the trip, and within the first 500 miles, we discovered, and this is a longer story, which I won't go into, and how we discovered it, but we discovered that our saddles were hurting our horses' backs.
Mm.
We knew that the horse's behavior was perfect at home. It was getting worse and worse on the road. And we kind of assumed it was like the pine and they weren't used to bears and it was like all different. And we discovered edema under the skin. So we had no open sores or anything like that, but we were taught how to palpate for edema under the skin, which would be the precursor to something much worse. It's a bruise, basically. And he, being an innate engineer, engineered a solution to the problem. And we fixed all of our pack saddles and his saddle with that solution. And the horse's behaviors went back to perfect overnight.
Wow.
So we had been punishing them, disciplining them, trying to figure out what to do to correct their behavior, when really they were just suffering. So we came home and patented our solution and started Orthoflex Saddle Company we lived in a 22 by 20 foot garage that we made into an apartment and made saddles in the back barn. We lived in that little thing for 5.5 years while we paid off the deficiency on his bulldozer debt and grew our company. So that was how we got into it. And I was involved in the saddle and fitting business for 20 years. So that kept me in it. And we first appealed to endurance racers because they were the only people who rode enough to know they had a problem.
Mm.
Cutters, reiners, ropers, jumpers, they all had problems because we could see it on their horses' faces and the way they carried themselves. But endurance racing was what we got into and kind of stayed into by sponsoring some racers.
That is an amazing, amazing story. And you sort of answered my next question, but I love this. You went to your pastor and you had a conversation, like, how does this happen? He says, do what you want to do. It'll still be there when you get back. You made arrangements, and then you went on this amazing journey that you wanted to do together.
Yeah.
And then it sparked a business idea. And sometimes it's like jumping off that hamster wheel can really inspire or lead you to what's next for you. And
Absolutely.
I just love that story. Thank you for sharing that with us. So you founded Orthoflex Saddle Company after this big ride. Tell us a little bit more about the kind of saddles you wound up developing, and is the company is still active? Is that correct?
No, it isn't. But I will explain how that went. That's a little bit part of the book, and there'll
Hmm.
be more written about that in my next book, I hope. We'll see how that works out. But yes, we started in endurance racing, and the first step was we found somebody who made saddle trees who knew about saddle fit
Mm.
in Tennessee. So we partnered with him. So we were able to design the trees the way we wanted them to. And the saddle itself is a tree that doesn't impinge on the horse. So it might have a little bit more twist and flare to the bars. So there's a wooden structure inside the saddle. There are bars that go on either side of the spine. And then a flat spring panel was mounted to the underside of the bars, very thin, ultimately glass field acetate called Delrin. And then it was graded with different layers so that the flexibility would be right from the mounting point. So what it did was that when the horse moves, extends its front leg, that shoulder, as you probably know, goes back 4 to 6 inches, usually right ram into the fore English saddle or the front of a Western bar. So whenever the horse is trying to stride out, it's getting hit by the tree. And this can be a problem trying to go downhill if a horse doesn't want to go downhill straight or jigs a lot or will stopping the calf, or he can't stand to turn right around a barrel. Often that's the problem. I started writing articles about this, and at the Purina Race of Champions, which was a big endurance race, I was telling the editor of Trailblazer magazine many years ago, I said, this is what we've learned. She said, well, you write about it. And I wrote a 5-part article about it for the Endurance Racing magazine. And so we had people who were like quit riding their horse or just rode bareback until they got one of our saddles. They were that convinced, and then they did by and large had good results from that. So the what happened was we started in endurance, but then other fields, people would say, oh, would you make one for this field and that field? So we ended up with, and this is not good for a business, I'll tell you that right now, 52 models of saddles.
Oh, wow.
So imagine the complexity in manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
You might have 30 dies for one saddle to cut out the pieces, and they were all handmade for the customer, not for the horse, because again, it had to flex with him as he moved.
Mm-hmm.
And after about 10 years at the height of our company, my husband had a really serious head injury in a motorcycle accident. And that messed everything up. And he is, I will say, doing great now and everything, but we were together another 7 years. And a lot of things went kind of sideways during that healing process. He ended up taking bankruptcy after our divorce. And unfortunately, if you get us, we cash flowed all of our growth. So we solved a problem, people had a problem. So we kept growing and growing, and we never had to get any loans or investment, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But at one point we got an SBA loan, and a Small Business Administration loan will attach not just your property, but your intellectual property. Mm-hmm. So that got sold. I think it would be worth people knowing that when they get a loan, find out if your intellectual property is being attached in that loan and really decide if that's right for you. The other thing that I love to tell people, and I think this would be a great platform, there are a lot of mom and pop businesses out there. And unfortunately, the way our corporation was set up, he was the only corporate member. And I was younger, and we trusted each other implicitly. So when it came time to decisions being made that I disagreed with at that time after the accident, there was nothing I could do about it. So I think setting up your corporation, if you are a horse business person, so that you have say if something happens to the other person, and I don't mean just death. I think that's really something important that I never heard before.
And thank you for sharing that point of view, because these are the conversations that sometimes, I mean, when you're young, you don't know, or when you're first starting out with anything, a new business or writing a book or creating a piece of music or what have you, you don't know about these things. And often, you're so excited to get this thing done that there's a lot of things that get left on the table. And I think a lot of people who've waived those contracts know that. And, you lose rights to a lot of different things. Like there's book authors who have lost, their international rights or their audiobook rights or, movie and TV, a big segment of that doesn't go to them, merch, like all those things. So I'm actually glad that you said that. Now, and we're talking a lot about the saddles, which is a phenomenal idea and obviously was successful. And you've moved on and you've created some new things here that we're going to talk about. But like, how do you handle, or how did you handle the loss of something that was so important to you that you created in a partnership that kind of dissolved? How did you handle something like that?
Yeah. Lots and lots of tears
Mm.
and guilt. You have to roll with a lot of stuff. And so that was really super formative for me to lose the marriage, lose the company, lose my identity, lose Christmases together as a family. And I like to talk about that because how many of us are going through that kind of thing? Not the whole loss, but I mean, the loss of your family unit. So, I mean, just really a lot of tears, but I think my faith was a huge thing for me. What was so cool about all of this happening was it was humbling. And I think I was humble before, but it was super duper humbling. And I was forced then, the next job that I came across after surviving through a winter selling prearranged funerals door to door.
Oh my. Yeah.
Knock on the door and get people to let you in and look at caskets. Okay, I could pretty much do anything if I could do that. I did get hives doing that. But anyway, I got through that and I found some farmers who needed help marketing their heirloom crop. And I found a grant to pay me to help them do that and got the grant for them. Well, I got their product into 300 supermarkets around the Midwest in the first 6 months. And I'm like, oh, maybe it wasn't all Lynn. Maybe I wasn't an idiot and I helped do this orthoflex thing. So the blessing, of course, is that I was able to support him all those years, but then I was able to be on my own and figure out, oh, you know what? I do have a brain in my head.
Mm. And thank you for sharing that. I mean, that is, I think a lot of women go through that in their relationships or in business or in anything. And then when something dissolves, there is a time of self-doubt and reflection and crying and getting out of there, but then realizing on the other side of it, I'm not my partnership. I am not my business. I am brilliant and capable of generating whatever I set my mind to. And I think a lot of women go through that. And I'm so happy to hear that on the other side, you were very empowered because, I mean, we're about to talk about these amazing things that you've been up to since then. Did you want to comment on that a little bit?
Well, I think the only thing that I wish, and I would love to say this to any woman who is embarking on a new life after a divorce or loss of any kind, and that is, I wish, and I don't know if I could have done this any differently, but I wish I had had more fun. I was always so worried about making enough money to make ends meet and working hard. I would just hope that anybody would somehow try to dial back that fear of losing your job or making enough money to make ends meet if you didn't end up with a big settlement. So, which I didn't, obviously.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you for sharing that. So we're gonna move over a little bit and start talking about the journey that led to the book that you've written that you're here to discuss today. Talk about empowered. Why in 2012, at the age of 54, did you decide to take a trip across country solo?
As you may remember, I said that I hadn't intended to take the first trip with a man, and he kind of led the way. I always wanted to take it by myself or with a girlfriend. So at every life passage where I felt really super low, I just had this visual image of me riding down a road on a horse by myself. But I always pushed it away. I can never do that. I've got kids or I'm married or whatever it is. I had a counselor who was also the pastor of my church. And she said, you need to do this trip. And you need to start talking about it because I didn't have a horse at that time. And then it just so happened I got the idea to call a buddy who used to work for me at Orthoflex Saddle Company and is a good mule rider and horse trainer. And I said, Rick, I want to take this horseback trip. And he did not say, "Are you crazy? Why would you do that?" He just said, "I got a horse you can take."
Oh,
And so
that's
that's a true
awesome.
friend. That's a true
Yes.
friend. And so he sold me Chief, who is the subject of the book. And I had done this before, so I knew I could do it.
Mm,
And of course, the two things that a person is afraid of on a trip like this is, if you've done it before, is getting hit by a car.
mm,
And that's pretty much it. Because you discover when you put yourself out there vulnerably that people are wonderful.
mm,
We all are kind of brainwired to help each other. That is how we have anthropologically, through evolution, we have survived as a species by having relationships to keep ourselves safe. And so having relationships and helping each other, I think, is totally brainwired into us if you quit listening to cable news
yeah.
long enough and actually get out of the house.
Hmm.
So, I mean, just like you and me, you're meeting all these wonderful people, and like,
Hmm.
how is it that you haven't run across a mass murder? It's because there's not very many of them.
Mm.
But yeah, so I got the horse, and my husband, now my third husband, sorry to say, but I'm happy to say because he's a great guy. He was worried about me taking it because he thought maybe I would not really want to be around him anymore, that I would get swept up into that and be this adventure or whatever. And I said, "No, it's not that much fun. I've done it before. It's really, really hard work. It's like not fun at all." So anyway, he says, "No, you need to do it now. You got to quit talking about it. You need to just do it." So that's what I did. I only had Chief for 2 months, and I knew from experience that you really can't plan a long distance trip like this if you are not trying to promote yourself or something.
Mm,
You know, there are people who want to do a trip and it's kind of an ego thing. I want to go from this coast to this coast, or I want to promote this message. And that was not what I wanted. I wanted that experience of being alone with my horse and exploring my beloved Midwest. So for that reason, I did not seriously plan my route. I thought, okay, well, I'll take off from his pasture and I'm going to do a loop around Missouri. And if I'm gone 3 months, that's the max. 3 weeks, possibly, or 3 days if I completely failed. So I took off and rode south, and then I rode into Missouri. And as I'm thinking about riding a circle around Missouri, I thought I'd cut over into the Ozarks. And I knew better, but there's Truman Lake, Lake of the Ozarks, and Stockton Lake, kind of all along the western side of Missouri. And when they created these recreational lakes, they put in dams.
mm,
And the dams made all the tributaries big and got rid of a lot of tiny tributaries that we could easily go over. So consequently, there would be long bridges that I would have to go over, which are dangerous. I don't want to be on a long bridge with a horse.
mhm.
So I ended up riding straight south. Well, Carly, what that ended up doing was taking me right back to where I was in high school, where I divorced my childhood sweetheart. So I ended up riding right back into that area and right back to Nevada, Missouri, where our business failed.
Oh my goodness.
So little did I know, you know what? Those people don't care. I mean, that was a long time ago. It's like, go do your life. People don't care what's going on with us. That's the big message. And I ran into so many people I knew, and they were so kind. And of course, they understood the bind I was in, getting divorced after the head injury and all that. And it was the most healing time, to just kind of realize that. So it's okay. It's probably okay if you go meet the thing that you're most in angst about.
Hmm. Very
So,
healing.
yeah.
It's almost like you were led there,
Yeah.
you know, to resolve some of the things that you're hanging on to and to get that clarity that, we worry so much about what other people are thinking. Other people are not thinking about us. They're doing the same thing we're doing, thinking and worrying about themselves. So it's a
Right.
really great point. So when you set
Thank
off
you.
on this, did you plan on writing about the experience? And you want to talk a little bit about the Big Quiet One Woman's horseback ride home and explain where the inspiration for this popped up from?
I also being genetically a horse lover, was genetically a writer from the time I was little. So I knew I wanted to write this book, and I knew I wanted to try to bust myths about rural America and about what people are like and what religion they are and what political party they are. I wanted to write about how they are the same as city people. They just usually have a little more space around them, and about the beauty of the Midwest. I mean, just the physical beauty of the landscape. So that was what I am passionate about, and that's what I wanted to write about. So we can talk about the difficulty of figuring out the structure for it and trying to rein it in. But that's why I wanted to write a book, and I did from before the trip.
So you knew you were going to write it before you took the trip. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, awesome. Now, you just mentioned the difficulty of structuring. Talk to us about the writing process.
I'll just start by saying I had notebooks that are kind of shaped like this, long, oblong spiral notebooks, and I wrote in those every day he was grazing or at night. I wrote all those notes. So I had raw footage, which were generally visual impressions more than anything, and also spiritual realizations too. I probably didn't try to start writing for a year, and I started trying to write chapters, and I did that throughout a year or two, but I was also working. At the end of that process, I was very disappointed in what I had written, and I just completely gave up. And I took a job as a grant writer for an inner city nonprofit. So grant writing has been something I've done. I would not recommend trying to be a creative writer and a grant writer in the same life.
Sounds challenging.
It was like awful. But I was there for only 6 months. I think I did them a lot of good. I got them organized and so forth. And I just told the boss, I said, I have to go write my book. And I came home and I started writing again. And the chapters were, I thought, phenomenal. And my husband, being a pretty acclaimed literary journal editor for many, many years at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, he just kept telling me, you keep going. Don't give up. This is going to be good. And I think part of my angst about it was I wasn't understanding the structure. But the thing that I would advise writers is go with the energy. So there be a vignette that I just wanted Carly Cade to read. I just want someone in the world to know this happened. I want them to meet these people and see this place. And then I would just go for it. I was fortunate because we knew Robert Day, who wrote the Last Cattle Drive, which was a major bestseller back in the late 70s. And he sat me down, he read what I'd written, and he talked to me about structure. And he said, it's a road show. It's about the horse going and you going every day, which is like the Last Cattle Drive was a road show. And so was Huckleberry Finn, in a sense. They were making that journey. And then in between those days of this happened this day would be me kind of riffing on my discovery, what came to me about that, or remembering something. And that's kind of where some of the personal stuff from my past might come up. So that really helped me to structure it. And then it was a matter of just getting rid of any story that would seem too repetitive, which I'm sure I should have gotten rid of more of those vignettes. But anyway, I did the best I could.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love that journey, or the moving forward down the road, and then the awakenings that you had every time you paused. I love that. Did you have any troubles sharing these very personal things that happened for you through your memoir, or did you find it cathartic?
I am a little allergic to people who write for catharsis. So I don't think I would say that was it at all. And I would say that I probably shared just a small portion, but you've heard of people who are oversharers. I might be one of those. So it didn't bother me. I felt kind of shame and guilt for some of my past for long enough that I think I was kind of over it. And if it could make someone else feel better about themselves or about what they've experienced, or me, but maybe make someone else feel superior, that's also good. This risky part about that, writing that personal stuff, and the way I tried to do it was to not overdo it. You have to, as a writer, have composted and digested all that. And I think you got to come at it with a loving attitude. not with an axe to grind or with a poor me, because the writing's going to be crummy. It's never going to get published. So I've really been kind of waiting until I've got it composted a little bit better, which I think I'm there. I think I'm there actually. Yeah. So it wasn't that hard to write some of this stuff.
I love how you just summarized that. That's lovely. Composting it and coming to it from a place of love. And that's what they say about storytelling. Like, humans have been storytellers since we evolved, or since we were plopped on this planet, and that's how we learn. I mean, one person can't have all the experiences that there are to have, but there people can find similarities in your story, that the story that you're sharing. And I think that is very brave to write a memoir and open up about these things for others to learn from, right? And that's why humans tell stories. So it's like it's I think it's fascinating, and I thank you for sharing your journey so other people, other women, other couples, other horse lovers can learn from your experience, right? Whether they want to take a long distance ride with their horses, or whether they're having a challenge in their relationships, or if they're looking to restore their faith in themselves, like all these things. So that's how we learn, I think.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That really makes me feel good. That was one of my main goals.
Perfect. You did it. I mean, I think people that share that information and write memoirs are very, very brave. I always enjoy memoirs. I always get something. How did taking this adventure change your view of building relationships with animals?
I think what I got more than anything was what Ray Hunt and Tom Dorrance and Cal Middleton are trying to remind us, and that is, who is that being? What is their personality? What are they needing? What can we do to make them comfortable? I mean, all a horse is ever trying to do is become comfortable. So I think that I just ended up taking him as he was. And, things like me putting up my tent the first time, he nearly pulled a, steel fence out of the ground. And then after that on the trip, that was his home. I could pop it up next to him and he was like, fall asleep. So it was just exposure to build that relationship with horses. So I would say that to anyone, that if you really want to learn what it's like to have a relationship with a horse, aside from somehow hanging out with Ray Hunt the rest of your life, is to take a long distance trip, and don't take your type A job with you. So if you take lessons, if you ride, you show, and you're doing it like you would do your job, for the same reasons you would do your job, probably never going to have the right kind of bond that will be lasting and keep you safe. So that's and the other point I would like to come up with is just, to me, a horse's heart is like this giant electromagnet, right? And there is some sort of electrical resonance that occurs from just standing next to one, or imagine wrapping your legs around it, right? There is, especially if you get away from the barn and you're riding out, it's the same kind of resonance that you might get if you're sitting and looking at a lake or watching a fire burning. It's that. And I think that gets us close to creation. And creation could be, given many names, but I think that for me, what it did to me, and this is kind of getting into another one of your possible questions, but after 1 week of being in the wind and the hot sun and the weather and not knowing where I was going to camp that night, I just became nonverbal. And week 2, I realized that I was just following my instinct, that I would just do something and it would be the right way to turn, or I would knock on this door and it would work out. And I wasn't planning. And I am a planner. That's my job, is to plan for agriculture producers. And then by the 3rd week, I had just an emotional experience riding past a cemetery, which I'll let you read about in the book. But this sense of protection descended upon me.
Wow.
I can't explain it other than to say, I've always kind of thought of it as a spiritual relationship, kind of being something around me or out there I'm relating to. But this wasn't like that. This was like the physical world, every blade of grass, the wind, the sky, the dirt, the horse, everything was just suffusing me with complete protection.
Wow.
It was wild. And, once you know something, you can't unknow it.
Hmm.
You know how that is?
Hmm.
So it didn't mean that I didn't worry about, will I find a good place to camp tonight? I was always scared that I wouldn't have water and, what would I do and all that. But I think actually it didn't make me not scared, but it did kind of hone the week two's thing. And that is, my instinct was so good because I had an experience where there was one potentially bad guy who approached me, and I knew it from a quarter of a mile away.
Hmm.
So I think that bond with horses helps you get in contact with whatever it is that our prophets who went for 40 days and 40 nights, or the Buddha who walked forever, helps us tap into that.
Oh my gosh, I have goosebumps. That's amazing. And well, and it's almost like remembering that we are beings, we are animals, like but we have this gift of speech, but we also, in our real, like in our houses and our walls and our buildings and our businesses, we don't have to utilize our nature gifts all that much. And that's, you were speaking to, that's that feeling, that thing we get as horse people being around our horses. But a lot of people don't have exposure to that. But if you quiet the mind, you quiet yourself, you get yourself out into nature, and you let it happen, and you go nonverbal, you can have those experiences, these uplifting experiences, or this experience where like your animal being actually connects and guides you if you listen, right? And I love that you shared that. Thank you. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I like the way you put that too. I can't wait to listen back to it because I want to write that down.
Is there anything that you wish you had known when you started out on this trip? Or any advice you would give to someone starting off?
Yes. And this is advice for life. And that is, I wish I had had more confidence in myself.
Mm.
I wish I had known how capable I was. I didn't really tell too many people I was doing this.
Hmm.
And I really didn't want to promote myself or advertise that much. But if I had more confidence, I would have probably told more people. I might have created more social media. That might have helped me publish my book if I had created more buzz and more following. There's a part of me that says I might have had more fun if I had had a horse that wasn't quite as reactive.
Hmm.
But, I'm sort of that person too. Why am I criticizing him for being reactive? And here's the other thing, advice for anybody wanting to take a horseback trip. You got to have a horse with a big motor.
Mm.
I kept him moving the first 4 hours of every day. And you cannot have a cold-blooded deadhead and take a trip like this. So you really need a guy with some real personality and some real thoughts of his own. And well, at least no bear's going to catch up with us.
Yeah.
If,
Yeah, I love that too. How old was Chief? Was he was he younger, or was he older?
he was 12.
12. Okay, so he was like right in the middle there.
Yeah.
Um, and he was reactive. I sometimes think though, I feel like because he was reactive, it did build the confidence that you would wish you had had going into it. Like the whole trip built your confidence. But it's like, do you think that he was the right horse? Like, because what he was doing kind of had to make you deal and cope and get present to his behaviors that maybe scared you a little bit, but built your confidence. But I feel like it's kind of like a teeter totter sort of thing, and there's balance
Hmm.
somewhere in the middle.
That's a really good question. And it brings me to this philosophical thing I want to say, and I have no PhD to back this up, but I don't think there are a whole heck of a lot of accidents in the world.
Mm.
He was a great guy, and he was like sweet on the ground, and he was the best horse with Girl Scouts, and he just loved to stand around and listen to people talk. His only real flaw, if you could call it that, was just that he was hyper vigilant when he was moving through a strange territory.
Hmm. And that's what they're designed for, right? To be hyper vigilant and look out for their well-being. And in doing that, he was looking out for your well-being. He was protecting you, even if it was scaring you. Like that's what, when
Yeah,
they're doing that, that's what they're doing. They're like protecting themselves and the person on their back.
he was brain wired. I took him away from all horses in his herd.
Hmm.
That is that's cruel, really, if you think about it. Horses, when you see these Westerns where the guy's going to ride off across the desert and go to Mexico by himself. Well, you know what? I'll bet you that horse has all of his buddies off camera over there, and he's happily going toward his buddies.
He's going
He
toward the
is not
herd.
going away from everybody. It's just they really need to be with their clan. And when he got back, he just leapt into the air and go found his best buddy in the
Oh,
pasture and rolled, and he was so happy to be home. So,
wow.
I took good care of him and I sprayed him up and all of that, but it was a lot to ask of any horse.
And he did it for you. And I love that though, too, because there was an awakening of your appreciation of him as a being, not only in what he was doing for you, but also in what asking him to do this took him away from. That's like
Right.
really, really great noticing.
Yeah, that's what Tom Dorrance would have told us. What
Mhm.
does this horse need to be comfortable? He's not saying, what do all horses need? Here's how I'm going to impose my will. And the last thing I'd like to comment on about that is I ran across a couple super good horsemen. One I knew, one I didn't really know. And they both were, one was in his 70s, the other one was in his 50s, I'd guess. And they both said, because I was asking him, am I being too easy on him or am I being too hard on him? Because I
Mm.
was really kind of confused about it. And they both said, I used to force my horses to do things. And now I let them look and I let them get to the point where they're ready to do things.
Mm.
That was helpful.
So it's like asking as opposed to, and giving them a time and space as opposed to forcing them through something. That's powerful. And they both said it. Both horsemen said it, which I think is,
Exactly the same way.
yeah, I love that. So talk to us about, I want to move a little bit into a couple, author questions. Like, talk to us about publishing this book.
I sent the proposal and sample chapters after it was all completed, which most people would never spend the time to do that, to probably 60 agents and publishers, and was rejected by all of them. And the University of Kansas book author said, you should talk to Tracy Million Simmons at Meadowlark Books. She specializes in books by Kansas authors or books about Kansas topics. So I contacted her, I sent it to her, and she loved it. That was how I met my publisher. And working with her was a dream. She really did love the book. She loved the writing in it. And she did help me kind of pare it back a little bit, but she didn't really do a whole heck of a lot of editing other than really super good copy editing. So the process with her was great. And my husband, having been in publishing and being an editor for 46 years, he was very opinionated about how it should look. And so she, God bless her, let us do whatever we wanted with how the book was laid out.
Oh, that's
And
lovely and lucky. That doesn't often happen when you work with a publisher. That's great.
right. I went to a writers conference in New York City. Bob sent me to it, my husband, and Robert Stewart is his name from UMKC. The magazine was New Letters that he's editor emeritus of. And he sent me to this conference, and I did speed dating with some agents. So they pair you up with agents in New York and you do the speed dating with them. Both of the two that I got said they wanted to see a sample of the book. But the first question both of them had was, how big is your following?
Isn't that interesting?
The days of just being a writer and focusing on a gorgeous sentence are gone.
Yeah, they really,
unless you're established. Yeah.
yeah, they really are. I was just having a conversation with somebody about this the other day. It's like now you have to bring a following or a presence or a brand with you behind your books. And you mentioned a couple of things, like how wonderful are author partnerships. And that's why I believe in our authors uniting and that other authors aren't our competition, because another author friend directed you to the publisher that was right for you. And I love that you said, you actually shared that the agent said, what is your following? That is something all people getting ready to write books really need to realize, is that it is part of the mix now. For you, what's the very best part about being an author? And then on the flip side of that, what's been the most difficult part?
For me, the most difficult thing is because my retirement isn't set, I do feel worried about spending hours and hours writing when I don't know what the financial outcome will be. The best part about being a writer is spending the hours and hours writing. So to me, the best part is when I have an image that something I want to get across to somebody else, and I find that amazing, different, fresh, unique way of describing something that really puts them there. And also as I'm writing along and getting to the end toward the end of a chapter, and it's kind of, I can just feel it starting to wrap up, and realizing that something universal is going to tie it all together. And the only way I would have found that wonderful ending was by writing.
Oh, magical.
Yeah.
So writing's it for you. Yeah, on both
Mhm.
sides. On both sides. What's next? What are you curious about? Do you have another book in the works? And
I
what are you up to?
do. I
Yay!
do. Well, I'll go ahead and hold up the current book because I
Yes.
forgot to do that earlier. This is the current book, The Big Quiet One Woman's Horseback Ride Home. And I have a manuscript of poems almost ready to go. It's called Points of the Horse. Each poem is about a minute part of a horse, whether it's the ear or the chestnut or the coronary band or whatever. And it was a writing assignment from a teacher. It became, I just loved writing these very minute, and it could only be this long. It couldn't, half of one page is the longer it could be. So I'm working on that. And then I wrote a full manuscript about saddle fitting, what we learned over 20 years of saddle fitting with 25,000 horses, more than that. And I originally wrote it, and I looked at every study done on the thoracolumbar spine of the horse's back from the before 1900 to about 1987. And then recently I went back and looked at every study that's been done on the horse's back from 87 to now. And now I want to rewrite that whole book. And Bob has suggested that I bring a lot of my other experiences and maybe the first horseback trip into it. So it might not be a scholarly how-to book. It may give me the structure, I haven't figured out quite how, to bring in all of this other stuff, because it's just a miracle. I mean, nobody talked about pounds per square inch when I first started writing about it. Nobody talked about impingement of the shoulders. And weirdly enough, people still don't really get the anatomy of the saddle as it relates to the anatomy of the horse. So that is, I think that I can relate impingement in personal life and on the horse's back somehow. That's what I'm excited about.
Oh, I love that. Right. I mean, what I like, and I think he's onto something, because I love this. It's like giving the information to people who may not know it, and sharing that knowledge, that scientific stuff, through personal experience and storytelling. That is a very good way to connect this information, because I know saddle fit is like a thing and so important, but I was not educated in it as a young person. And as a younger person who's getting into horses, I certainly wouldn't go and pick a book on saddle fitting, a nonfiction book on saddle fiction or saddle fitting off the wall, like a how-to thing. Like that I would want a story. I mean, both are important, but I feel like you can reach a lot more people through the storytelling aspect of a memoir and winding all this information in. Because every time I read a fiction book, even though it's not real life, right? It's fictional characters, I always get something happened between the characters that I can apply to my life. I have learned something, even if it's fiction. So, or even if it's a story, so I think that's fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. You're actually putting it into even better context for me, because I wasn't sure how to do it, but that's really helpful to me for you to say that. Thank you.
So I want to wrap up with this question, and everyone has a different answer to this one too. But Lisa, what does creativity mean to you?
I find that an easy question to answer. I think it goes back to that quiet or that resonance with the deeper part, because when you're doing something creative, generally time sort of stops, and somehow you've allowed yourself to stop doing other busy work. And it's that moment when you feel like whatever you're doing is the most important thing in the world, and you're kind of transforming the way you're thinking or what you're doing or whatever the medium is. So I think getting to that meditative place in the process of doing whatever you're doing, that's creativity to me.
Oh, that's my favorite part. I love that you just shared that. Yes, I love that. flow state or something where you just don't even feel like you're there and the time is flying and you're just happy and all these thoughts aren't running through your head. I love hearing that you have that experience too. That's very, very special. Great answer. Lisa, I've really, really enjoyed talking with you today. I look forward to, continuing our author friendship. But in the meantime, will you share with listeners where they can find more information about you and your books?
Yes, they can find Lisa D. Stewart Books and Products on Facebook. They can go to lisadstewart.com and learn more about me and read some of my blogs. And you can also just go to Amazon and order the book there if you're interested in it. They'll have it, and it really doesn't matter to me as an author whether you purchase it from me or Amazon or from one of your favorite independent bookstores would be ideal. But do what's best for you. Those are places you can find me.
Excellent. And I will link to the places where you can find Lisa in her show notes. And she's shared some really wonderful pictures of herself and her horse that you can also take a look at there with the show notes. Lisa, thank you so much for the gift of your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Thank you ever so much for having me, Carly.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. I hope you enjoy these Q&A sessions with wonderful equine authors who love all things horses and riding, just like me. Visit my website, carlycadecreative.com, where you can read the show notes, and make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you so much for your support. Want a free guide to secrets of horsebook authors? Gallop over to carlycadecreative.com/wisdom to have author advice delivered instantly to your inbox. If you are an author who writes about horses and would like to be spotlighted, please let me know. Visit my contact page at carlycadecreative.com to fill out a request. I'd be happy to have you on the show too. Thank you for tuning in to the Equestrian Author Spotlight podcast. See you next time. I'm your host, Carly Cade. Creative writing makes my spurs jingle.